what an incredibly inspiring session we've just had. What I'll take away from that is that lifelong learning needs to become a basic human right that Sebastian touched on. And to continue with the whole theme of lifelong learning, let's just use your green cards and your red cards again. So if you can lift up your green and red cards, if you consider yourself a lifelong learner. So green is yes and red is no. Wow, so virtually everyone in the room, except for a couple of people, don't consider themselves lifelong learners. That's extraordinary. Okay, so we've spoken about the rapid change that's taking place. What about implementing all these changes in the classroom, on a grassroots level, with policymakers and governments? What are they doing to bring about these changes? I'd now like to call upon my next two panelists to come and join me on the stage. So we've got two people who are in great positions to actually address these issues of how to implement these. We've got His Excellency Slim Khalbous, who's Tunisia's Minister for Higher Education, and Sarah Borgman, Director of the Skoll Community and Convening at the Skoll Foundation. Thank you both for joining us. Sarah, I'd like to begin with you. I mean, we've heard a lot about lifelong learning and what it means, but what does it mean to you?
Well, I want to thank the previous speakers. They're very inspiring, and as a mother of 3 children who are almost in school and in school, I have much more confidence than I did, I think, 35 minutes ago about where they may end up, so thank you. I'd like to actually remind ourselves that lifelong learning looks different in each region or in each country context. And for us at the Skoll Foundation, lifelong learning could look like 3 of our social entrepreneurs who work with different kinds of populations. So for example, Bunker Roy at Barefoot College is teaching grandmothers, and that's who he specifically recruits, to learn how to engineer solar panels and bring all that information back to villages where they live and become experts in that field, and language barriers don't matter. And so that's one context. Another could be community health workers with Raj Pujami at Last Mile Health and Chuck Slaughter at Living Goods. Community health workers are needed all over the world, and that's another example of lifelong learning, not necessarily making a driverless car. And third could be midwives. I know a very wonderful woman, Karatalain, who runs an organization named IDSP in Afghanistan, and she's teaching young women right out of high school to become midwives and empowering them to be able to go into a family situation, take charge, and really provide a lot of value to that family. So lifelong learning doesn't necessarily have to be on a computer. It doesn't necessarily have to be in a book or in a university. In some of the developing world, lifelong learners could look like those examples.
Minister Khalbous, I mean, we all know that Tunisia has gone through major upheaval and uprising, and the whole system has changed in the country. So in terms of education, just give us a sense, it's a young democracy. How are things starting to shift and change? And is the whole idea of lifelong learning now being adapted? And just to remind our audience that Mr. Khalbous will be speaking in French, so if you wanted to put on your headsets.
Thank you. J'ai essayé de parler en français, s'il vous plaît.
Well, I will try to speak in French if...
Vous avez tout à fait raison.
Yes, indeed, you are absolutely right. A lot has happened
en Tunisie,
in Tunisia over the last few years. And we've changed the political system, and this has completely changed our education system. There is a demand in terms of education that has completely changed as well. And as we're talking about long life training, people who have left school are now coming back to school.
d'une manière générale,
the reform of the education system has completely changed. Previously, we had a system where only one person was making decisions. There were no real negotiations. There was just one vision and one choice. And right now, we have many decision makers. We have different lobbies. Everybody can speak out, and everybody does speak out because everybody has something to say about education. Tunisia was able to implement this transformation through education. We've worked on education for a long time. We have very few natural resources, so we've decided to go with education. Education is free and compulsory up until the age of 16, and that's been the case for the last 60 years. And as a result, we have a generation that has been able to withstand this brutal, this dramatic change in society. So there is, of course, the economic issues that we've talked about, but there's also all the social issues that come with that. Right now, it has a true impact on social dynamics, on the changes in society. Education is crucial to bring about change, and lifelong training, is crucial to that.
Is that something that has now been sort of implemented within the changes in Tunisia? Is lifelong learning something that is being adopted as part of the culture of education?
Oui, absolument.
Well, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. We have lifelong training that is now fully integrated in the educational process. And as I mentioned, we have several programs for literacy, for example, in remote areas, rural areas, but it's a long-standing program that is still running right now. Right now, literacy rates are very low in our country. But what is new, however, today is that you have people who have a job in a company but who decide to come back to university to get a new degree. In your introduction, you talked about people changing jobs, and jobs that will be created in a few years' time. And there are also some jobs that are disappearing. And as a result, in Tunisia, there is a strong demand for a new kind of education from people who already have a job in big companies.
To bring you in on the conversation, because one of the criticisms that Jörg and Sebastian made in general about educational institutions is they're not equipping the next generation with the right skills. Do you think that's the case?
Absolutely. I think when I used to work at the Department of Education a number of years ago, we had this running joke, and this was, I'll say again, a number of years ago, and it's still as relevant today. May not be funny, but it's still as relevant. That the classroom are nostalgic museums for parents, so that we can go back into the classroom and we can remember what it was like when we were there. We don't have this kind of expectation in our workplace. We expect to have upgraded computers. We expect to have all different kinds of things, and in the classroom, we just don't. And students are still expected to be independent contributors to their own self. And they study and they take a test and they're studying for that test. And a lot of times that's what the teachers are teaching. I'm glad to say I do think it's changing a little bit with regard to the soft skills, where students are collaborating together, where they're learning critical thinking skills, where they're grading one another, where they're being encouraged to make presentations. Even in parent-teacher conferences, they are actually, I had the experience of my daughter, telling me how she was doing in class, which I thought was a great skill. But it's just certainly not happening fast enough. And the entrenched, the education system is an entrenched system like any other system, and I think the disruptors who are changing things from the outside, I think Sebastian's one of them, I think Sal Khan is one of them, at Khan Academy can have a real difference outside of the classroom and prove some concepts and then hopefully make them true in the classroom. And I'll say one last thing, that foundations can really help underwrite some of the risk of these outside disruptors and prove concepts so that they're not as risky for policymakers, public officials, people who have been elected to then put those, to implement those new activities in classrooms, and essentially they've been proven at that point.
Because it seems to me that there really needs to be a sense of urgency about this, to train and equip the next generation, or we will be left behind, as Sebastian and Jörg said, that we won't be ready for the massive changes that we're to be expecting.
Absolument, absolument.
Absolutely. You know, in a country that put the emphasis on education, as I was telling you, wrong choices have been made, which means that today 50% of unemployed people in Tunisia have a tertiary education degree, which is dramatic for a country like Tunisia that placed its bet on education. Now, there are structural dimensions, obviously, but wrong choices have been made at the university and school levels. The lack of adaptation to the job market is illustrated today through teaching methods as well as the content of teaching. It is extremely difficult today to import this new approach, which is the competency job approach. Diplomas don't mean much today. Employers, when they are asked today, why do you not hire this or that person, for example, because what I need to explain is that what is paradoxical in my country is that there are many unemployed people with degrees, and yet employers tell us they find it difficult to hire qualified employees. We conducted surveys to understand why, and they tell us that it's very seldom a technical problem. The problems are soft skills. So we come back to the idea of lifelong learning. If there are lacking competences in some areas, such as computer engineering, for example, what people need are continuous training over the course of a few days, but soft skills, this is not something that can be taught over a few days. It starts at the primary school level, and it goes all the way to university. So the failure of the education program starts at the primary school level, and it is then felt all the way through the job market. And I think that lifelong learning is a way to integrate all of these skills that are not necessarily technical skills. I'm also talking about soft skills, something that needs to be taught from the very beginning all the way to the end. So it's the learning of soft skills that will enable us to better integrate degree holders on the job market. So we are working on competencies and skills, but also we are working on how to learn. Jobs are changing so fast that it is impossible for schools to teach everything. So we should focus on teaching.
I mean, what are you doing now? Because you've been on both sides. You've been an educator, and now you're the Minister for Higher Education in Tunisia. And you're identifying and highlighting the problems. You're saying that, yes, there is this issue. So is there something you're fundamentally doing differently?
We are currently implementing a large-scale reform, and the most difficult thing today, the main opposition comes from the teachers themselves, which is impressive. Society, civil society broadly speaking, is more ready to accept these changes and the new vision than the people in charge, that is to say teachers. Teachers are reluctant because teachers will be the ones that will have to change the way in which they do things. They need to change their vision. They need to look at pupils through another lens, which is very difficult. As decision makers, we are working on the change in the mindset of teachers. And we are also working on the training of teachers. We need to accompany, we need to support teachers so that they can be the catalyst of change rather than oppose changes.
Change, Sarah, is always a difficult thing, isn't it? It's something that people really grapple with. I mean, we were hearing as well from Sebastian and Jörg that just when change happens at such a rapid rate, it's actually quite difficult for people to come to terms with it.
Yes. In fact, I'm one who's not a huge fan of change myself, so I think I can I can understand that. You know, I was just reflecting that the affluent in the world always have opportunities for their children to do internships or externships, and therefore gain both those soft skills and understand what it's like to be in an office environment or you know, an environment that's different than the classroom. I'm reminded of the National School to Work Office, which was an initiative about a decade or two ago, where the US government was working with the private sector, this is right at the beginning of the tech boom, to bring professionals into the classroom and to have students as young as grade school go into professional environments to see how technology was being used. And this is way before anyone had a computer in the classroom. And I almost feel like we should go back to that model, because things are happening so fast, as we've just learned and we're discussing, that the institutions of those schools can't change quick enough. And so perhaps really enlisting the private sector, for whom these students will be working someday, and giving the private sector some opportunities to showcase and give back could be a really positive development. And yeah, it was a good experiment back then, and I think it potentially could be workable again.
You've spoken about your experiences in the United States. We've heard a little bit about the situation in Tunisia, but if you could expand, because you do a lot of work globally, and could you tell us a little bit more about attitudes towards lifelong learning globally?
Sure. I think first and foremost, access to education. I mean, lifelong learning is a wonderful aspiration, potentially at this point, besides the examples that I gave earlier. Access to education, encouraging girls to be able to go to schools. As we know, girls being part of an education, or being able to get an education, can really change entire systems. And so access, and then next quality, and then I think lifelong learning. The environments that need those kinds of jobs, I'm reminded of MasterCard in the MasterCard Foundation in Africa. They work very closely both with the private sector and with students to make sure that those who are learning in the classroom have jobs when they come out, and that those who are looking for those kinds of skill sets are making sure that they're in the classroom as well. And so therefore, you're making matches prior to people even coming out of schools. And this could happen, I mean, lifelong learning in some of those environments starts right after high school.
Yes, Minister, do you want to?
Il y a un exemple aussi à citer peut-être justement par rapport
I'd like to give you an example.
nouveaux besoins d'apprentissage
When it
tout au long
comes
de
to
la
the
vie.
new needs of learning throughout life today, some companies get in touch with us. These companies are doing market surveys. They try to anticipate the changes that will occur in terms of jobs in their field. They come to us and they say, could you help us? Could you support us so that we can successfully operate these changes? There's a collaboration with the private sector. I think it is really interesting, because the private sector can give us some clues when it comes to the changes that will take place over the next few years, and maybe universities have yet to anticipate such changes. Of course, there are academic, scientific changes, but when it comes to the developments on the labor market, usually the hints are given by the private sector. So we need to create platforms for exchanges between companies that work in the field and the world of academics, which is very challenging for developing countries like Tunisia.
Indeed, indeed. And on that note, can I open it again to the floor to get some questions on the issues and the challenges that both Sarah and the Minister have raised. I'll take number 2, number 6, and number 7, right at the very back.
Hi, this is Noura from Kuwait. I was wondering, while you are talking about homeschooling, do you think it's helping students to act in lifelong learning, more than school?
Okay.
This is a question.
That's a great question. Thank you. And I believe number 6 and number 7 at the back.
Yeah, good evening. Very interesting discussion is going on, but my question is very challenging. It's a lifelong learning, and I'm reading it other way around. Learning make long life. One of my old student, he was Xbox chief, Xbox head, for the time after doing IIT and all. And all of a sudden, one day, he thought that, let me become a stand-up comedian. So it's very interesting that it's not necessary that lifelong learning should be related to some profession. I think every child in today's society, whether we talk about the Asian countries or European countries or Western countries rather, there is a parental pressure. And if we remove that, then every child has two children in his heart. One is which he is living the dreams of the parents, and the other one when he like to live his own dreams. Because when I asked this child, he said the first part of my life, I was living the dreams of my parents, and now I am living my dreams. So the thing is, lifelong learning should have this particular element of thought process also. Thank you.
Indeed. Thank you for your comments, sir. And we'll take number 7, please.
Good evening. My name is Luyolo Mazwen from South Africa. I wanted to stress a point on learners who live in remote areas, in rural areas. You know, there can be education, but if there's no access, if there's no easy access to education, so what are we doing about that? Because there are education institutions, but you have pupils who are struggling to get to the institution of education, and it's a real issue. How can we solve that?
Thank you.
And also, I have a last question. The other one is there's always graduates who are unemployed, and that demotivates some of the people. So, like, what is it? I'm directing this to the Minister of Higher Education. What is it that the people in education can adopt to make sure that every person who's going through an education institution and is getting a degree, there's a job waiting for this person to kill unemployment?
Thank you, sir. I would come back to the panel. One of the questions that was raised was, does it have to be a traditional school? What about homeschooling? And is that a method of providing lifelong learning?
I believe so. I think homeschooling can be an amazing way to instill and motivate children to be curious. I mean, literally, the world is your classroom. And if you can take advantage of that through parent networks or online resources, which are now much more available than they were even just a few years ago, you can really, I think children can really gain a lot from that. There are some of us for whom homeschooling would not work because it'd be very quick. My children would very quickly surpass me in intelligence, so I would not make a very good teacher, especially in the sciences or maths. But however, parents should also provide that in the off hours when students are not in their classrooms, and the world can still be and should still be the classroom of the future.
Minister, your thoughts on that?
Je suis assez d'accord, mais avec des nuances.
I must say that I agree. Although it must be qualified, I think that remote schooling or homeschooling is absolutely necessary. And it is part of education today, but we need to put the emphasis on relations. We conducted an experiment in a number of schools. We have virtual universities, that is to say online courses. It was very successful for some time, and then after a few months, students themselves asked to meet each other. They wanted to meet face-to-face so that they could share face-to-face. So it had nothing to do with technical teaching. It had to do with building human relationships, even though they were able to communicate on the online platform. But at some point, they felt the need to meet each other. So I agree when it comes to the technical aspects. But at some point, human relationships are very important and should not be neglected.
And the other question that was raised was, again, about this issue of remote communities, people who don't have access to basic education, let alone attempting, to tackle lifelong learning.
We had a panel earlier this morning where we talked a little bit about this subject. And we sort of agreed that that peer learning and peer-to-peer motivation can be much more influential than parents, especially as you move into your preteen and teenage years. And so several of our school entrepreneurs use alumni networks of students to recruit house to house sometimes, both in Africa and in India through an organization called Educate Girls and another called CamFed, who's actually a WISE laureate as well. And so by enlisting young people to help educate, recruit, maintain the curiosity of their peer group, I mean, there's almost no better kind of motivation.
Minister?
In emerging countries, the problem is different. Why? Because teaching in rural areas, and we have many rural areas in Tunisia, has to do with sustainable development. It is about development, quite simply. Today, teaching in rural areas is of a lesser quality. Why? Because these areas are not attractive to students, they are not attractive to the best teachers, and because obviously they lack financial resources, which means that the working conditions for the teachers are of lesser quality and therefore do not appeal to teachers, for example. In Tunisia's rural areas today, we find it difficult to motivate teachers to go to rural areas. Not because the work is not interesting, on the contrary, there's an important social dimension, but because the lifestyle, the living standards are of a lesser quality. Teachers will tell you, what do I do in the evening with my family, for example? What about entertainment? What about my kids? How will I provide education to my kids in such a remote area? So the attractiveness or the lack of attractiveness of an area undermines the quality of the school. So it is part of the wider development problem. This is why today we try to put school at the heart of development programs. But we cannot reform school alone. We need to put the emphasis on development.
And trying to implement these various issues to try and keep up with our ever-changing world. I'd like to thank you both, Minister Khalbouz and Sarah Bogman, for joining us here on stage and telling us about the challenges that you face in your countries. Thank you. Thank you both.